Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Always ready to explore these topics.
Today we're tackling something pretty profound. We're going to be talking about grief.
Yeah, it's a heavy one, but honestly, I think it's something we could all understand a little better.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we've got this amazing worksheet that's going to help us do just that.
Oh, interesting. A worksheet, huh? Like a structured way to think about it.
Exactly. And, everyone experiences grief differently, right? But this worksheet really digs into some of the common patterns and, maybe even some of the pitfalls that we can fall into when we're grieving.
I like that, pitfalls, because there are definitely things you can do that might make things harder, even if you don't realize it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump right in, huh?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so the worksheet kicks things off by defining grief, which seems pretty basic, but I think it's good to have a starting point,
Yeah, what's the foundation we're working with here?
right? So it defines grief as the natural emotional response to a significant loss.
Okay, that makes sense. Natural emotional response, loss. Makes sense.
Yeah. And of course, most of the time when we think about grief, we're thinking about the death of a loved one.
Hmm.
But it's not always that. It could be loss of a job, loss of a relationship.
True, true. Any kind of major change can trigger those feelings of grief, really.
But what I found really interesting was uh, the worksheet goes on to list all these different ways that grief can actually manifest, like it's not just sadness.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What else is on the list?
So it mentions crying, obviously,
Mm.
but also laughter,
Yeah.
throwing up even, feeling totally numb.
It's wild, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily think of those things as being part of grief, but I think it's so important that they point that out because I think it can be really confusing for people.
Totally. Like you're going through all these things and you think, is this normal? Is this part of grieving? And it really can be.
Yeah, and I think that ties into this whole idea of like the right way to grieve, which is what you were talking about earlier.
Right. And the worksheet really pushes back against that,
Yeah. Yeah.
that there is no normal way to grieve.
Because it's so individual, right? Everyone's going to experience it differently. It's like a fingerprint.
Yeah. And it can vary based on like your personality, your culture, the situation itself, so many factors.
And yet there's still this pressure, to grieve a certain way or for a certain amount of time.
Totally. And I think the worksheet helps us see that those expectations are just not realistic or helpful.
They can make things so much harder for people who are already struggling.
For sure. So if we let go of this idea of normal grief, how do we start to make sense of these different experiences?
Right, because there are patterns, even though it's so individual.
Well, the worksheet breaks things down into two main types of grief, which I thought was a really useful framework.
Okay, two main types. Lay 'em on me.
So first you've got acute grief.
Acute. Okay, so that sounds like it's the immediate reaction, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's that initial wave of really intense emotions after a loss. We're talking shock, distress, sadness, maybe some changes in your sleep or appetite.
Like your body's just reacting to this massive shock. Makes sense.
Yeah, and sometimes difficulty concentrating. I know for me, when my grandmother passed away, I couldn't focus on anything.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like your brain's just not working the way it used to.
It's like this fog descends.
I remember when my dad died, I couldn't follow a simple recipe. It was like my brain was just fried.
But the worksheet is quick to reassure us that these symptoms are completely natural and will gradually decrease over time.
They will. But that doesn't mean it's easy while you're going through it.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful to know that what you're experiencing is, it's part of the process.
It's part of being human, really.
Okay, so that's acute grief. But then the worksheet also talks about complicated grief.
Okay, so if acute is that initial blast, what's complicated grief like?
So this is when those acute grief symptoms persist, sometimes for years, and the loss just feels impossible to manage. You might experience things like an intense yearning for the deceased.
Like a constant ache, almost.
Exactly. And there can be a lot of guilt around moving on, like you're somehow betraying the person you lost by, trying to live your life.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that in people who've lost spouses or partners. This fear that if they're not constantly in pain, it means they didn't love the person enough.
And the worksheet actually mentions a statistic that about 10% of people develop complicated grief.
Really? Wow, that's higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah. I think it's important to know that it's more common than we might realize.
It's not like some rare thing. Like, it's a real possibility for a lot of people.
Exactly. And the good news is that even though it can feel so overwhelming, complicated grief is treatable.
Oh, absolutely. Therapy can be incredibly helpful in those situations.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when my grandmother passed away, I felt stuck in this cycle of guilt for months. It was only when I started talking to a therapist that I realized it was okay to, move forward while still honoring her memory.
It's so common to get stuck, to feel like you can't escape the grief, but it's important to remember that there's help available, and it's okay to ask for it.
Totally. You don't have to go through this alone. And I think the worksheet really emphasizes that, that seeking support is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Yeah, it's like asking for help means you're taking care of yourself, which is what you need to be doing during grief.
Okay, so we've talked about acute grief and complicated grief, but where do things go from there?
Yeah, is there like an after to grief?
Well, the worksheet introduces this idea of integrated grief.
Integrated. Interesting. What does that mean exactly?
So it's not that you forget the person or that you stop feeling pain, but you've accepted the loss and you're able to, resume your daily life.
So it's like the grief becomes a part of you, but it doesn't control you anymore.
Yeah. And you can still miss them, deeply, but it doesn't stop you from living.
Like carrying a smooth stone in your pocket. It's always there, a reminder of your loved one, but it doesn't weigh you down.
That's such a good analogy. And the worksheet does point out that even when you've reached a place of integration, those feelings of acute grief might resurface sometimes,
Hmm.
like during holidays or anniversaries.
Oh, for sure. It's not like you just get over it and then you're done. It can ebb and flow.
Exactly. And that's totally normal.
It's like grief has its own rhythm, and you got to learn to dance with it.
Okay, so after all of that, I guess the big question is like, what does all this mean for us? For the listeners sitting there going, okay, interesting information, but now what?
Yeah, how do we take this knowledge and actually use it in our lives?
Right. Well, I think the big takeaway here is that there's no one-size-fits-all experience when it comes to grief.
It's deeply personal. We got to ditch the comparisons and expectations.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, even though grief can feel so isolating, it's actually something that connects us all.
Because everyone's going to experience it at some point, right?
Yeah, it's part of being human. And understanding the different types of grief can help us, navigate our own losses and also support those around us who are grieving.
And maybe even just be a little gentler with ourselves, you know? Like knowing that it's okay to feel all these different things.
Absolutely. So, we've covered a lot today.
We did? Grief's a big topic.
It is. But I think it's worth thinking about, even when we're not actively grieving.
Definitely. It's part of life. We got to be prepared.
And so I'll leave you with this. How might understanding these different types of grief change how you approach supporting someone who's grieving? Or even how you navigate your own grief journey in a healthier way?
Food for thought.
And remember, if you're struggling, there's no shame in seeking help. It can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. Reach out, get support. You don't have to do this alone.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure. We'll see you next time.
Until then.